Part 6. I loved East Lansing from the moment we drove into town. Large, towering shade trees greeted me at every turn. Small parks dotted the landscape. Even the campus of Michigan State University looked like a park, most especially at its center, where the Red Cedar River flowed, its banks lined with fat, quacking ducks that would surely pose a delight for any young child. The sidewalks were ample, perfect for pushing a baby in a stroller, and the streets were wide and smooth, far less congested than the roads of Chapel Hill. "Oh, Paul," I said, looking out the car window at all the glorious scenery, "this is going to be a good place for us. I know it. I can feel it in my heart." I turned to him, shocked to find that his face now bore the look of a frightened boy. He seemed to be on the verge of tears. I reached over and squeezed his hand, and for the first time, I felt true compassion for my husband. "I'm still with you," I said. "Believe me, it's going to be okay." And within a week, it was. Paul's fears, which began to dissipate after we settled into our new home, a spacious top-floor apartment in the shade of a gigantic oak, completely vanished once he was given a key to his own private office in the tall, red-bricked departmental building that housed 80 math professors. MSU was humongous, 40,000 students, and many of them engineering majors. Most of Paul's students would have a high aptitude for math. His teaching load, considerably less than that of a tenure-track professor at a conventional college, combined with his students' high aptitude for math, which meant fewer questions to answer during office hours, would leave him ample time for all of the math research he was expected to produce. Non-academics, just as I had when I first met Paul, regularly asked mathematical researchers, "What are you doing? Trying to figure out a new way of adding 2 plus 2? But the truth of the matter is that mathematicians hardly ever use numbers in their research. When you read any mathematical paper for publication, it's filled with more Greek symbols than numbers. The way I understand it, with my subpar mathematical abilities that earned me nothing more than lowly D's in calculus, mathematicians use their lengthy equations of Greek letters to build pathways into new dimensions. These new mathematical pathways, nothing but Greek to most of us, are what physicists use when they build particle accelerators, space stations, and even impressive theories that help to define the nature of our reality. While Paul spent the rest of that summer attempting to build pathways into new dimensions, I hit the pavement looking for a new job. At this point, I was 5 months into my still not so obvious state of pregnancy. Several different station program directors had invited me in for interviews shortly after I saturated all of Lansing's radio market with my resume and demo tapes. But each time I volunteered during the interview that I was pregnant, the happy smiles transformed into serious frowns, and there would be the quick wrap-up. "Okay then, thanks for coming in. We'll be in touch." As an experiment, I decided that if I were lucky enough to be interviewed again, I would remain mum about the bun in the oven. By the time my opportunity for another interview arrived, I was wearing maternity clothes, but they were so bulky and billowy they completely covered up any physical evidence that I was pregnant. During this interview, I was greeted with the same kind of smiles and enthusiasm that I had received at the other stations, but this time I kept silent about my expectant state. Call it a coincidence, But that afternoon, I found myself employed as a part-time weekday announcer at the local public radio station, WKAR. The station was not at all like WUNC. There were no snippets of conversations about politics, religion, or philosophy bubbling forth from the hallways. There were no shared lunches or evening meals, and I witnessed no polite exchanges of greetings or smiles. Never before had I seen within the walls of a radio station people behaving as if their job were nothing more than a means for earning a paycheck. The pall of seriousness throughout the building was so thick that soon I began to worry about the secret that was swelling within my belly. One day, burdened by the weight of this secret, I confessed to my new program director that I was pregnant. "But don't worry," I said. "I plan to keep working after the baby is born." I thought he would be pleased to hear of my dedication to his station, but instead he snapped, "Why didn't you tell me before?" "I didn't think it would matter," I lied. But it did matter because my life at the station became hell after that. At this station, unlike any other station I had worked for, the announcers' voices were recorded ahead of time on reel-to-reel tapes, front and back announcing whatever classical music would be played during the upcoming week. We made our recordings in the darkest, most depressing closet-sized studio I had ever sat inside. Though my program director had been pleased with all of my earlier recordings, after my pregnancy announcement, he transformed into an ogre whose mission, it seemed, was to destroy my spirit. Over and over again, he sent me back to the dark closet-sized studio where I had to re-record and re-record my front and back announcements for the classical music. When I returned to him with yet another tape of my voice, he would glare at me with a look of triumph that reminded me of the scene from MGM's The Wizard of Oz, when the Wicked Witch of the West sneers to Dorothy, "I'll get you, my pretty, and your little dog, too." Only for me, it wasn't a dog I was worried about protecting. It was the baby growing in my womb. This evil program director might not have been able to cast a magic spell on my baby, but he was causing me a lot of stress, and all those stress enzymes were surely having an impact upon the growing life within me. One time I caught the eyes of the program director lingering upon my belly. It was just beginning to reveal the bulge of pregnancy through the loose folds of my maternity shirt. In that moment, a flash of utter repulsion crossed his face. Why did he hate pregnant women so much? He had seemed to like me fine before he had known I was pregnant. In fact, at one point during my initial interview, he had gushed with genuine enthusiasm. "You worked at WUNC?" "Yes," I said. "In Chapel Hill?" "Yes, in Chapel Hill." "With Gary Shivers?" He had almost squeaked with delight. "Yes," I said. "He was my manager." "Well, anyone good enough for Gary is certainly good enough for me. You're hired." By now, I knew it was for Gary rather than me that his enthusiasm had been directed, because all I got now from this newly transformed ogre of a program director was an invisible gamma ray of hatred and disgust. Surely no job was worth this kind of torture, most especially if there were even the slightest chance my baby might be adversely impacted. I had been on my way back to my dark little closet of a studio to redo yet another tape when, struck by an arrow of inspiration, I stopped beside the ogre's desk and stared at him until he looked up. You know, I said, since I've mentioned my pregnancy, your behavior towards me has been rude and unsupportive. I feel as if you're repulsed by my pregnant belly. He visibly winced, as if in pain. I don't know what you have against pregnant women, I continued. Now I felt the angry beam of his gamma ray. But I've decided that no job is worth this kind of emotional crap. I quit. Very well, he said. Off went the gamma ray. His eyebrows lifted in satisfaction as he swiveled his chair away from me, back towards his desk. It was obvious I had given my enemy exactly what he wanted, but I didn't care. This was not a battle I wanted to fight. No job was worth keeping, I decided, if it couldn't be fun. The sunshine was glorious the day I exited, for the last time, the campus building that housed the studios of WKAR. As I made my way back home, feeling free for the first time in weeks, I happily imagined the growing baby inside me cheering me on. Since I assumed my visibly pregnant belly would prevent me from landing another job in the anti-pregnancy world of radio, I decided to look elsewhere for employment. Every day I searched the classifieds of the Lansing State Journal, and as I perused its pages, I began to notice with an increasing frequency which alarmed me, more and more stories about contaminated underground wells in the Lansing area. What in the hell is going on with our underground water supply? I asked Paul one day. Aren't you concerned about this? We can't live without clean drinking water. He shrugged. All of Paul's concerns at this point were of a mathematical nature. He had even quit complaining about my pregnancy and all those feedings and diaper changes that would soon be upon us. When I had also complained about the diesel smells from the city buses that were causing my head to hurt, he responded, "So quit riding the bus." Unfortunately, I no longer owned a car. We had sold my little Toyota Tercel back in Chapel Hill before our move, since we had assumed, wrongly so, that MSU's health insurance plan would not cover the pre-existing condition of my pregnancy. But without a job, it didn't make sense for me to buy another car, so I had been taking the bus as much as possible, driving Paul into work on those days when, during the week, I needed his car to drive across town to the OBGYN practice I was now visiting. One day, on my way home, sitting inside another one of the city's old buses, I was forced yet again to stop the bus so I could make a quick exit. The stench of its diesel fumes had brought on yet another headache. As I huffed by foot the remaining mile home, a vow launched within my mind. I will find some kind of a job, paid or unpaid, that will help me to clean up our environment. Even if no one else was alarmed by the stench of city bus diesel fumes or the dangerous chemical content of our underground water, I certainly was. That very afternoon, I contacted every environmental organization I could find in the phone book, and by the end of the week, I landed a volunteer part-time position at the Michigan Environmental Council in downtown Lansing. The Michigan Environmental Council, or the MEC, was responsible for monitoring and reporting upon any environmental legislation moving through the Michigan State Legislature. It maintained a newsletter which kept its members and donors abreast of every environmental happening within the walls of the state capitol. Created in 1980, the nonprofit agency had, At the time I came aboard in 1985, only two paid employees. Marilyn and Don, hard-working and filled with a sense of fun, were a joy for me to be around. I was the organization's first ever volunteer. Though most of my assigned tasks were of a secretarial nature, I would happily have cleaned windows, vacuumed, taken out the trash, or gone out for coffee for them. They appreciated my enthusiasm, and I appreciated assisting two individuals who were spreading environmental awareness within the state of Michigan. Very soon after I arrived, they decided it was time to expand beyond a paid staff of two, which is why they put me in charge of researching various company mailing lists that might be worth purchasing. They were hoping to expand their mailing list in order to further the public outreach of the MEC and therefore its donor base. In the near future, they told me, my volunteer position could very well become a paid position. That would be wonderful, I said. And then immediately I thought of Irene, a kind-hearted retiree who lived in our apartment building and who just might consider working part-time as a babysitter once the baby was born. If my hours for the paid position remained the same, I would only be gone from home 3 mornings a week. What a perfect job for a new mother. I would be raising a baby, but I would also have time to myself outside the home, helping to save the world on a convenient part-time basis. To everyone's surprise, including my own, my opportunity for saving the world came much earlier than expected. One cold morning in the beginning of December, Marilyn and Don happily announced that they had gotten a hold of some unexpected additional funding. "We can hire you full-time now," said Don, "and since your due date is Christmas, your new position can begin after you're back from your maternity leave." "We figured you would want 4 to 6 weeks off," Marilyn said. My heart sank. The thought of being away from my baby for a full 40 hours a week, even after a maternity leave of 4 to 6 weeks, made me feel sad. "I'm sorry," I said. "I don't think I can spend that much time away from my child. Could I maybe bring the baby to work? They make these cloth baby carriers now that strap to the mother's body. You might not even know the baby was here." Both Don and Marilyn vigorously shook their heads no. "That would never work," Marilyn said. "Babies are too noisy." "But there's that woman down the hall, the attorney who keeps a playpen in her office for her baby," I countered. "Her baby's not noisy." "That's because her baby's hardly ever here," said Don. "The playpen is there for those few times when her babysitter is sick." "But you two are out of the office so much of the time," I said, "and it's not like anyone ever stops by." "No," they both said in unison. "Well then, would you be willing to hire me on a part-time basis? Think of the money you would save. And if 3 mornings a week isn't enough, I would be willing to come in 5 mornings a week." "No," Marilyn said. "Having you here has made things easier for us, but it would have helped more if you could have been here full-time. We have decided we need a staff of 3. If you can't work for us full-time, I'm very sorry, but we'll have to find someone else." After a long, melodramatic sigh, I said, "I just can't do it. I can't work for you full-time, but I'll keep working as a volunteer if you like, until the baby is born." "Are you sure about this?" Don asked. "Yes," I said, "I'm sure." "Well, we'll certainly miss you after you're gone," Marilyn said, but I doubted I would be missed for too long. By this time, less than a month away from the due date, I was beginning to feel like a small whale, and the larger I got, the more active the new life within me became. Many nights, Unable to sleep because of the baby's kicking, I left the bed so I could stand in front of the bathroom mirror. Holding my nightgown up, I would watch in the mirror as beneath the skin of my abdomen, the shape of a foot, or what looked to be an elbow, poked its way into view. I've got a creature inside me, I would think, absolutely thrilled that someday this creature would be outside of me. I couldn't wait to meet him. This was before the time of routine midterm prenatal ultrasounds, which, if the parents are interested, often enable them to learn the sex of their unborn baby. But I had had a dream which I thought was just as accurate as an ultrasound in determining the sex of my child. Shortly after our move to Michigan, I dreamt I was holding a baby boy. Surely such a dream was prophetic. Even Paul was convinced. After I shared with him that my favorite boy's name was Benjamin, he said he liked that name too. So it was decided. Benjamin Paul Bourdon would be the name of our baby. We might even call him Ben when he was older. Paul's brother commented over the phone one day, "Ben Bourdon, I like it. Sounds like the name of a football player." But the December due date soon passed us by, and there was no Benjamin. Now we were into the new year, 1986, and I was beginning to worry that my body would never go into labor. One morning, I woke up feeling more exhausted than ever from all the tossing and turning I had done the night before, while baby Benjamin had kicked incessantly at my bladder. I knew I wouldn't be able to make it into the MEC that morning. I was simply too exhausted. I called Don and Marilyn to let them know they wouldn't be seeing me that day, and then instantly I fell back into a deep sleep. I awoke again at 10 that morning with a tremendous pain in my abdomen. Holding on to my stomach, I got up to pee and found the toilet full of blood when I turned around to flush. Oh my God, what was wrong? My hand shook as I dialed the doctor's office. "Lansing Women's OBGYN, may I help you?" came the voice of the receptionist. "Yes," I said after telling her my name. "There's something wrong. I have this horrible pain in my abdomen that isn't going away. And there was all this blood in the toilet when I got up to pee. What should I do?" Tears were already forming in my eyes. Was I getting ready to lose baby Benjamin? "Sweetie, calm down and take a deep breath. I want you to call your husband and tell him to get you to the hospital. Don't worry. It sounds like you've finally gone into labor." I hung up. Labor? This couldn't be labor, not according to the hospital-sponsored 6-week-long birthing class we had taken in the fall. The nurse from the class had explained to all of us mothers-to-be, sitting in a circle with our husbands in the comfy carpeted community room of a neighborhood synagogue, that our contractions would occur with increasing frequency as our labor progressed. "Don't leave for the hospital until your contractions are spaced at 10-minute intervals," she had told us. But how could I time my contractions when the pain inside me wasn't ending? I called Paul. Thank goodness he was in his office. "You need to get home," I said. "The receptionist at the doctor's told me I'm in labor, but I haven't been able to time my contractions. The pain is non-stop, and there was blood in the toilet. I think something is wrong." "I'm on my way," Paul said. It was a dark day with heavy, low-slung clouds above us as we drove the 15 minutes to the hospital. At least the roads were dry, no ice, no new snow. But God, the pain was awful. It felt like the insides of my body were swelling to the point of bursting. Why wasn't I getting a break from the pain? This was not the way labor was supposed to be. When Paul and I arrived at Sparrow Hospital, I discovered that even though I knew something had gone terribly wrong inside my body, not a single person at the hospital shared my concerns. "Here, dear, sign these forms." chirped the lady at the registration desk, as if I had just casually walked in to have my temperature checked. Couldn't she see I was suffering? I already filled out these forms, I gasped, at the end of my birthing class. Those were pre-registration. Now we need you to sign the registration forms. Can't my husband fill out these forms? I'm in a lot of pain right now. We won't be able to help you until you sign these forms, she said, staring at me until I grabbed the forms, quickly blinking tears from my eyes. Though I was sure it was only 10 minutes, it felt more like an hour, but at last I was carted in a wheelchair to a room on an upper floor. They called it a birthing suite, but it looked like a regular hospital room. Tall metal bed with side railings, one bathroom in the corner, a brown vinyl recliner for Paul to sit in while he waited. I didn't notice until much later that there were metal tables, lots of cabinets with drawers, and other sorts of hospital equipment in the room, such as a fetal monitoring machine. I was told to change out of my clothes and to put on a hospital gown, and when the nurse returned, she directed me up to the tall bed so I could attach a fetal monitor to my tightly stretched whale of a belly. The nurse gave me a reassuring pat, then announced, "Since this is your first time, it's going to be a long while before we see your baby. I'm going to pop out for a quick lunch, but I'll be back soon. If you need anything before I return, press this button here." She pointed to a red button near the bed, then out the door she flew. All of a sudden, the molecules of my body seemed to silently scream, "Get this monitor off now!" The internal feeling grew so strong I couldn't ignore it. So I ripped the Velcro strips of the fetal monitor off and threw it on the bed behind me. "You can't do that," Paul said. "It's there for a reason." "If my body tells me to take it off, I'm taking it off," I snapped. That's when something caught my eye out the window. Snow had begun to fall, transforming the gray world outside my window into a gigantic snow globe. At my body's command, it seemed, I was breathing deeply now, on my knees, doggy style, each hand atop a metal bed railing. But though I continued to breathe deeply, watching the dance of snowflakes from my perch in my tall hospital bed, I felt no joy at the beautiful sight outside. The heat of my hidden internal panic was rising. Never would I stand in the snow again, catching snowflakes upon my hair and eyelashes. No one could be in this much pain and not be in the process of dying. The pain, which began at 10 that morning, was growing stronger with each passing minute. The insides of my body continued to swell and to swell and to swell. At any moment now, I knew my body would surely burst open, like that grotesque scene of the fat man's exploding belly in the Monty Python movie, The Meaning of Life. I would have asked for a painkiller, but we had been told during those useless birthing classes that pain medication was not safe for the mother or the baby. Consequently, at that time, Sparrow Hospital had a no-drug policy for young women in labor. "We do it the natural way here," I was told by a nurse at check-in when I had asked, just to make sure whether or not the hospital policy on such drugs had changed since the last week of our birthing class. Why in the hell had we bothered to take those stupid classes? Not even the breathing techniques we had been forced to practice had done me any good. "Do your breathing," Paul had suggested as I stared out the window at the snow. He was referring to the Lamaze-style breathing techniques we had been forced to practice each week in the birthing class. I had tried the breathing technique, but immediately my body had silently screamed, "Get back to the slow, deep breathing, now!" "I can't do the damn hee-hee-hoos," I spurted out between breaths. "My body won't let me." Had I learned anything at all that was of value from that class? And then I remembered. The shofar. One evening, during the beginning of one of our classes, a horn had sounded from another part of the synagogue. Instantly, my heart had lurched, and I stood as if on automatic pilot, ready to follow the sound into what I assumed was the sanctuary of the synagogue. "That's a shofar," the nurse leading the class quickly explained. "It's a ram's horn. They blow it to mark the beginning of Rosh Hashanah." I sat back down, the spell of the ram's horn partially broken. What had I been thinking? I couldn't just barge into whatever ceremony was taking place in a synagogue I knew nothing about. I closed my eyes as the shofar continued, fighting the urge to follow a sound that was new, but at the same time hauntingly familiar. Were there memories of this sound encoded in my body's DNA, passed on to me by some distant, long-forgotten Jewish ancestor? Remembering the shofar as I perched doggy-style on my tall hospital bed, I now regretted my lack of boldness that day in class. I should have followed the haunting sound of the ram's horn. Perhaps then I would have had no regrets about a birthing class that had not in any way prepared me for what I considered to be my terminal state of agony. If not for my body's mutiny against me, controlling me now, forcing me to breathe in a slow and steady rhythm, I would have been screaming. It was as if my dictatorial body had declared, "No time for screaming, only breathing." And so I continued my long, deep breaths while I kept my eyes glued to the falling snow outside my hospital window. But in my mind, where my fear lay trembling like a trapped animal in a cage, played a continual soundtrack of my sheer panic. Something is wrong. Something is wrong. Something is wrong. Why had I not had any contractions? Why all this non-stop pain? And why in the hell were there no nurses in the room with me? Didn't anyone in this damn hospital know I was dying? Something is wrong. Something is wrong. Something is wrong. And then came the change. "Paul," I yelled, "my body is telling me it's time to push. Go find a nurse. Tell her it's an emergency." For what was probably only 5 minutes, but seemed more like 5 hours, Paul searched the hallway for a nurse. His search would have been easier if so many nurses had not all decided to go out for lunch at the same time, but at last he found one. In she dashed, her face flushed with a message that was perfectly clear. "You first-time mothers, always such a bother." "Lie down so I can examine you," she muttered through tight, angry lips. I lowered myself to my back and spread my legs open. "Oh my God," she gasped. "You're fully dilated. I need to go find a doctor." Paul kept repeating, "Don't push. The doctor will be here soon. Don't push." But it was hard not to push, so I returned to my knees so I could concentrate on the dance of snowflakes outside my window. The snow was falling harder now. On and on my body continued breathing, all the while in the back part of my brain my panic increased tenfold. Now it felt as if my body wanted to push a gigantic watermelon out my butt. How could I possibly survive such a thing? There would be massive tearing. At the very least, I would bleed to death. There was no way, absolutely no way, I would be getting out of this alive. Something is wrong. Something is wrong. Something is wrong. At last, Dr. Wise, one of the obstetricians from the OBGYN practice I had been visiting these many months, came bursting through the door. He was a large man who, minus the jokes, could have passed for one of my favorite comedians at that time, the equally large and, to my mind, teddy bear lovable John Candy. Now especially, I was thankful to have the doctor rather than the look-alike comedian at my side. Dr. Wise looked larger than ever due to the green tent-like surgical garb he was wearing. "I'm in between surgeries," he explained, So you need to push this baby out as quickly as possible." Positioning himself at the base of the bed, which had, thanks to the nurse, sprouted 2 stirrups for my feet, he looked at me and, raising a commanding hand that reminded me of Moses from the story of Exodus when he stretched out his hand over the sea, Dr. Wise gave the order, "Push." Nothing happened. Down came the hand. "You're not pushing." "But I am," I whined. "Not correctly," he admonished. "Bear down towards the bed when you push." And he gave the mattress of the bed a quick slap for emphasis. "Towards my butt?" I shrieked. "Yes, towards your butt." Good Lord, this baby really was going to come out of my butt. Hoping beyond all hope that nothing else would exit my butt, I gave it my best shot, feeling all the while like a woman in the middle of the most gigantic and surely most public bowel movement in history. "Good," said Dr. Wise. "Do it again, as hard as you can." So I pushed even harder, and out came a completely new sound from my throat. Paul told me later, "You sounded like a wild animal." Keening is what came to my mind as soon as I heard it. After 3 or more pushes, accompanied by the sounds of my own primal keening, the baby was finally out. "It's a girl," Dr. Wise happily proclaimed. "Benjamin's a girl?" My shock lasted only a second. Thank goodness Paul and I had decided a few weeks before that it might be a good idea to have a girl's name on hand, just in case we were wrong. Little Miss Abby Marie Bourdon, weighing in at 8 pounds 14 ounces, had been born at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, January 8th, 1986, after exactly 3 hours of labor. The nurse handed Paul a small, newly bundled, red-faced, squalling baby who was not at all happy that a tiny bit of amniotic fluid had just been suctioned out of her nose. His face lit with a joy I had never before seen, and I remembered then that long-ago message from the inner voice. He will be fine once the baby is born. How right the inner voice had been that day. Paul was in love. Looking back, I would say my true honeymoon period with Paul began the moment little Miss Abby was born. That may have been because for the first time in our relationship, Paul and I were able to focus on something other than ourselves, our newborn baby daughter, whom we both loved. We were on the same team now, changing diapers, rocking and singing, sponge bathing and bouncing a little baby who continued to remain quite fussy. The only reason Paul didn't help with the feeding was that I was nursing Abby. But it was Paul, more so than I, who learned how to still the fussy cries of our newborn. Somehow he discovered that when he placed one of his knuckles into her mouth, she would clamp down hard, using her gums like a vice, and gnaw like hell upon his finger, which made me wonder if she were getting back at Paul for all the ugly things he had said during the earlier months of my pregnancy. One evening, I found myself singing a simple lullaby to Abby that began, "Little Abby is my baby. She's such a pretty little thing." Paul overheard my soft singing and said, "Hey, she's my baby too." How much Paul had changed. How much we both had changed. "For unto us a child is born," that line from the book of Isaiah made famous by Handel's Messiah oratorio, ran through my head like a broken record that month, though there was an earlier passage from Isaiah that seemed a more apt description of our newly transformed relationship. "The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light." We were so happy with our fussy little baby who, after a few weeks, finally became not so fussy, that sometimes I caught myself worrying that our good times might end, that some sort of disaster would occur that could wipe away the happiness we had only recently discovered. My biggest fear was that Abby might die of sudden infant death syndrome, a strange and mysterious condition which had only recently popped upon the radar screen of worry for parents at that time. As a precaution, I checked her frequently while she was sleeping in order to make sure she was still breathing, which meant, of course, that I didn't get much sleep. The dark circles beneath my eyes, I decided, were a small price to pay for peace of mind. When Abby was a little older and appeared to be out of the SIDS danger zone, my worries took on a new flavor. What would happen if history repeated itself and I died suddenly before my child were old enough to remember me, as had happened with Alice, my mother's mother? It never occurred to me to worry about Paul dying unexpectedly, but perhaps this is because he had always boldly proclaimed, ever since I had known him, that he was going to live to be 100. When my mother was only 3, her mother Alice had been killed in a car accident while driving 2 farmhands home from their long day's work in the fields of my great-grandfather's farm. The road to their home was dry, dusty dirt, made all the more dusty by 2 teenaged school bus drivers who, after having emptied their buses of their young passengers, decided to race each other. Due to the excitement of the race and all the dust being stirred on the road that day, neither school bus driver saw the approaching car until it was too late. My mother, who was in the back seat of that car, was the only one in the vehicle who survived. And though she was left with permanent scars upon her body, she had no memory of the accident and no memories of her mother. What if a similar thing happened and I died before Abby's mind could hold any lasting memories of me? The thought of my daughter carrying the same empty sack devoid of mother memories that my own mother had carried all of her life filled me with a panic so intense that one night I decided it was time for me to take action. I would begin keeping a formal journal. That way, my daughter would know me, even if only upon the page, if I were to die when she was too young to remember me. Unfortunately, it was harder than I had expected to convert my newfound enthusiasm for creating memories for my daughter into actual written words upon the page. After purchasing a new hardbound journal from the local bookstore, I found myself staring at a crisp white blank page night after night. Either I had absolutely nothing to say, or I was still in the grip of the debilitating writer's block that had struck me down after the trial of Amy Rigsby. "How long are you going to sit there staring at that journal?" Paul asked one night, as I leaned against the headboard of our bed, gnawing yet again on the top of a pen as I waited for inspiration to strike. "For as long as it takes," I said. At first, I thought my verbal constipation would dissolve after diligently staring at the blank page off and on throughout the day for 2, 3, surely no more than 5 days. Instead, the days crept into weeks. But finally, one night before bed, words slowly began to appear. "Wow," Paul said. "You're actually writing." I smiled. "Yes," I said, pleased that he had noticed. Recently, when I looked over this old journal of mine, I realized that part of my problem back then was that I had cared too much about creating perfect sentences. My first journal looks like a carefully crafted junior high composition book filled with timid writing that is waiting to be graded by a teacher who is not easily impressed. In my later journals, my writing looks like hastily formed scribbles, filled with a purpose and a tension that changes the actual shape and slant of my words, depending upon what emotion is being expressed. My earliest journal writing may have been timid and carefully crafted, but I felt empowered every time I looked over my newly filled pages. Now Miss Abby would have a way of knowing her mother, no matter when I died. How I loved staying home with Abby, watching her peaceful little face while she napped, snapping pictures of her when she wasn't napping, singing to her, feeding her, and going for walks with her, keeping her strapped to the front of my body in a cloth baby carrier when it was cold, and in the seat of her stroller once it was warmer. By the time summer arrived, she would often be straddled over my hip as I stood upon the bank of the Red Cedar River on the MSU campus. She giggled and cooed and patted her hand against my arm as I threw breadcrumbs to the ducks. The few times I tried to give her bread to throw, it had ended up in her mouth. She loved the ducks, and they sure loved our stale crumbled bread. But by the end of the summer, to my complete surprise, I found myself feeling antsy. I had been centering my life around a baby for 6 months, and though I cherished the many hours I had spent with her, I decided it was time to rejoin the world of adults. Now that I was no longer pregnant, I knew it would be easy for me to land a radio job. At that time, female broadcast voices were more rare than they are now. Commercial stations, especially, were always looking for new women's voices to fill their on-air shifts and the many 30 to 60-second ads that they were required to produce each week. My old early evening shift at WDNC in Durham would have been perfect for a woman with a baby, I decided. If only I could find a station in the Lansing area that would allow me to work those same hours. That way, Paul could be at home with Abby in the evening while I was at work, and I could be at home with her during the day while he was at work. Once again, I blanketed the Lansing area with my demo tapes and resume, and within a month, I was back on the air again, this time announcing light rock in the largest, newest FM studio I had ever been inside. And at the top of each hour, I would happily proclaim, "You're listening to Light 101.7 FM, WILS. Now my life was an even mix of motherhood and career. During the day, I was at home with my baby having fun. During the evening, I was at a radio station having fun, playing music with a bouncy beat during my on-air shift from 6 until 10, and producing commercials for an hour or so afterwards, using whatever theatrical voices my inner thespian felt inspired to mimic or create. I would have done this job for free, I loved it so. In fact, if not for one tiny ongoing glitch in my weekday, my life would have been perfect. Each day before I left for work, ready and waiting for Paul at the door, pocketbook slung over one shoulder, Abby perched atop the opposite hip, I would slip her into his arms as soon as he arrived. Always, she began to wail, her arms and body stretching towards me, her cute, chubby baby face wet with tears, and then my own tears would begin. Every night, Paul had to say, "Okay now, time to leave, you're going to be late." And every night, week after week, as I was on the road, on my way to work, tears would continue streaming down my face. Always. By the time I reached the parking lot of WILS, I had to turn to my reflection in the rearview mirror and give myself the same little pep talk. Stop being such a wimp. This is a good job and you love it. Now get inside and have some fun. After wiping my face with the palm of my hand, I would hop out of my car and walk across the parking lot to the back glass metal framed door of WILS, to the constant beat of light rock music reverberating throughout the building. I would then walk the length of the long hallway that stretched from the back door of the building to the announcer's studio. And by the time I pushed my way through the studio door, my transformation would be complete. Now I was totally pumped, a smile on my face, eager to begin yet another shift, announcing the music of Light 101.7 FM WILS. After my shift and the fun of producing all of my assigned commercials was over, I would head back outside to an isolated late-night Lansing parking lot, to the street lamp closest to the building where I always tried to park my car. By this time, I was driving a four-wheel drive, good for Michigan winters Ford Bronco 2, which we had purchased shortly after I landed my new job. The late-night announcer, a short, deep-voiced man who was slightly miffed that the early evening shift had not been given to him, never offered to escort me across the parking lot as the overnight announcer at WDNC in Durham had always done. And since I didn't feel comfortable asking this disgruntled DJ for help, I continued each night to brave the lonely parking lot by myself. The station's building was located in a dark and isolated area, so I was fortunate that night after night I never found anyone waiting for me in the parking lot. However, after a few months, a new man appeared in my life, and he began to stalk me inside the studios of WILS. The first time this unknown man slipped into the large announcer's studio, I assumed he was only curious. Sending a quick smile his way, I placed a finger to my lips, warning him to be quiet. Then I flipped the switch. What followed was the usual spiel of back announcements, promotions, time and the weather, then the station's tag, "You're listening to Light 101.7 FM WILS." I thought he would leave once the red glow of the live mic was off. He didn't. "You must be the new janitor," I said. The corner of his mouth lifted into a sneer. He said nothing as he slouched lazily in a metal folding chair 5 feet in front of where I sat, behind an L-shaped counter that held a large multi-tracked console and several tall plastic racks of music CDs and 8-track tapes. The metal folding chair was there for the occasional guest who would sometimes pop in during the morning man's show. Before that evening, no one had ever sat in the chair during my shift, because by the time I arrived at the station just before 6, everyone but the on-air announcer and the sales manager were gone. The sales manager was usually on his way out as I was coming in through the back door, and the drive-time afternoon DJ, whom I relieved, left the building as quickly as possible once he had finished his assigned commercials in the production studio. Here I was, all alone in a radio station building with a creepy janitor. So what did I do? I rearranged the stack of plastic 8-track cartridges, our recorded commercials for the next half hour. I also made sure my music CDs were in the right order. Then I reached for my thermos beneath the console on the counter so I could pour myself another cup of tea. Don't you have to get back to work?" I finally asked. The new janitor continued to sneer, bony knuckles casually linked over a skinny waist, long legs in blue jeans stretched out wide before him. He was, I noticed, unusually pale, with dark flyaway hair, and his eyes, very black and enlarged, seemed to be lit with a demonic fire. Charles Manson eyes, I found myself thinking. Keep it cool. Don't let him know you're afraid. Every night, for the rest of that week, he would come to sit and watch me. Some nights he watched me for only 10 minutes. Other nights it was 30 to 40 minutes. But every night he and his Charles Manson eyes, lit by that crazy maniacal fire, would appear during the last hour of my shift. My heart always would begin to thump, and the register of my voice would rise a few notches. Though I tried to ignore him, I couldn't. That same slouch in the metal folding chair, the same scuffed denim jeans, the same sneer, and those flaming evil eyes that played with me like a cat its prey. One night, at the end of what was by then the janitor's second week of observing me, both corners of his mouth lifted to reveal a thin, straight line of a smile. "You're afraid of me," he said. "No, I'm not," I said in a bright, chipper voice. "Why would I be afraid of you?" Giggle, giggle. That was the moment I decided I needed to purchase a gun. Wasn't that the way women on TV always handled such matters? I didn't know karate or how to wield a knife as a weapon, and I doubted throwing a rock would help. How else was I to protect myself when this man decided to pounce? I had heard that sometimes police departments offered classes in self-defense, but even if I could find such a class, I would probably be murdered by the new janitor before the class began. And those Charles Manson eyes told me that whatever torture the new janitor was planning, it would be slow and exceedingly painful. I dared not complain to my boss, Jack, the station's program director and on-air morning man. What would happen to me if the janitor were fired? Would he then be waiting for me one night next to my car in the lonely parking lot where no one would be able to hear my screams? I discussed the matter with Paul once I was back at home later that evening, and he agreed. Unable to be with me at the station because he had a baby to care for in the evenings, a gun was the only practical way I could properly protect myself in such an isolated section of town, all alone, in a radio station building, but for the disturbing new janitor whose eyes gleamed with such malevolent intent. The next morning, a Saturday, having left Abby at home with a trusted sitter, Paul and I now found ourselves before a glass-topped counter of a gun shop in what appeared to be a bad section of town. A balding man with a beard and a belly and two muscular, hairy arms stood on the other side of the counter. "This is the sort of gun you need," he said, pointing to 3 small pistols, "something small enough to put in your purse." But which one should it be? The silver pistol with the feminine-looking white handle, or one of the solid black ones that looked more like what a cop would carry? The only gun I had ever held had been a toy gun of my brother's, a silver cowboy gun with a white plastic grip panel. It was easy to imagine myself holding this other silver gun, the one before me on the counter in the gun shop. That settled it. The ladylike silver pistol with the gleaming white handle was the one for me. I moved my right hand toward it, opened my mouth to speak, and then came the soundless voice from within. "Don't buy the gun. I will protect you." My mind buzzed in shock. I hadn't heard from the voice since the early months of my pregnancy, when I had been told, "He will be fine once the baby is born." Since that time, I had moved to another part of the country, given birth to a baby, found work as a full-time DJ, and, most recently, had sunk deeply into a frenzied state of fear over a new janitor who had become a symbol for evil incarnate. With all that had happened and all that was going on, I had completely forgotten about the voice. Now that it was back, I hardly knew what to do. The man behind the counter tapped his thick fingers upon the glass. He was waiting. So was Paul. My head and neck remained bent towards the 3 guns. Could I trust the source of the soundless inner voice? How could it possibly protect me from a Charles Manson look-alike? Um, I think I need more time to think, I said to the beefy man behind the counter. Paul stared at me incredulously as we exited the gun shop. But by the time we reached the car, my decision was made. "Are you crazy?" he yelled after I told him of my decision. "You don't understand," I said. "Even though I can't really explain what it is, I've been following this voice for a long time. Not only is it the reason I married you, it's also the reason I got pregnant, remember?" Buckling my seatbelt, I found my mind quickly skimming over the past few years of my life. Suddenly the message, "He is to be your husband," and even the message, "It is time for you to get pregnant," no longer sounded so crazy. "What if it's God who's been directing me all this time?" I said. "Or what if it's something that belongs to God, like my soul, or a guardian angel, or some kind of a spirit friend? After all I've been through, I feel like it would be wrong for me not to trust this voice." "You mean now that your life is at stake? Now that you have a child to raise? Now that we live so far from any of our family members who might be able to help if you're killed?" My lower lids filled with tears as I considered that, yes, I might actually be crazy, and yes, the new janitor might very well be on the verge of killing me, and yes, a gun might be my only real and guaranteed form of protection. But what if the voice had spoken true? I had believed in this voice so completely when, at the age of 17, it had filled me with the tremendous force of its message, "The only reason you are here is to love." That night, I had felt as if I belonged to the source of the voice, as if I lived within it, and it within me. If everything I had felt and received that night were true, which action on my part would most fully embody an act of love? Buying a gun with the possibility of shooting this new janitor if he tried to harm me? Or trusting that I would be protected by this invisible source that I had sometimes heard silently and from within as a child, and that had been guiding me off and on for all of my adult life. I couldn't say what the source of the inner voice was. Perhaps my mind was making all of it up. But I realized in that moment that I still believed in it, whoever or whatever it was. I lifted my head to look at Paul in the car beside me. "I might be crazy," I said. "I can't prove that I will or can be protected by whatever it is that occasionally speaks to me from inside. But I have this strong feeling in my heart that if I don't trust in this voice now, I'll end up regretting my actions." Paul sighed in exasperation as he cranked the car. It was obvious he had no faith in me or this soundless inner voice, and a part of me suspected that he might be right. I wanted the inner voice and all that it had ever represented to be true. So much so, I now realized, that I was willing to take a risk that it might not be true. Still, though, I was very afraid. This time, for sure, I could be making the biggest mistake of my life. "You're crazy, you're crazy, you're crazy," was the mantra of fear that played in my mind as I entered the back door of the station the following Monday. The hallway pulsed with the beat of light rock, thanks to the rectangular wall speakers mounted in every room of the station. I imagined the music thrumming in the background as a soundtrack to a rape or to a stabbing. My own rape, my own stabbing. How long would the music continue to play after I was unconscious or dead? All night long, during a shift that felt like an eternity, I waited for what I thought would be my end. But the janitor never appeared. Was he playing some kind of a game with me? I was still just as frightened when I returned to work the next day, on Tuesday. But once again, no crazy-eyed Charles Manson janitor. Nor did he appear the following day, on Wednesday. On Thursday, as I stepped through the back door, I stopped the sales manager who was on his way out. What happened to the janitor who used to work here? He's in jail, he said. What? Yeah, we caught him stealing. He was selling stuff from the station to buy drugs. The cops arrested him this past Monday. Wow, I said, realizing for the first time that I had indeed been protected. Thank goodness he's in jail, said the sales manager. I don't know about you, but that guy always gave me the creeps. One might think that after such a stunning display of protection from my inner guide, I would have wanted to continue working for WILS, but as relieved as I was that I hadn't been raped or killed by the new janitor, my daily drive-to-work grief over leaving my baby behind continued. Abby's tears, as she watched me leave every night, never abated, and neither did mine as I drove the 20 minutes to the station each evening. After 5 months of crying myself to work, feeling desperate because I was convinced my tears would never end, I reverted to an old childhood prayer technique, placing my hand over the center of my chest where, as a youngster, I had assumed the switch for my internal God radio was located. I said aloud in my car on the way to work one evening, God, larger mind, soul, energy friend, whoever you are who's been guiding me, will you please provide me with an honorable way to walk away from this job? I promised them a minimum of 1 year, but I don't want the job anymore. I can't stand leaving my baby behind. I only want to work part-time in radio so I can be at home with my family in the evenings. Please, if it's at all possible, I ask that you help me get out of this job. Thank you. Amen. Within a week of that prayer, we received word at WILS that the station had just been purchased by a large corporation. Jobs might be lost, our station manager somberly told us one day. Oh, please, I prayed, let it be my job. Our new corporate leaders did not fire me, but they did cut everyone's salaries by 15%. This pay cut, I knew immediately, would be my ticket out, my honorable way of leaving. The next day I showed up at the station earlier than usual so I could discuss my situation with Jack, the station's program director. Jack, my salary is already low enough as it is, I told him. I can't continue working here if my paycheck is going to be cut that much. Yeah, well, there's nothing I can do, said Jack, leaning back in his chair, both hands clasped behind his head. They've made their position clear. If you decide to leave, you'll only make them happy. They're looking for ways of cutting corners. And the person they hire if you leave will probably make less than your salary, even with the pay cut. My position is firm, I said. If they slash my salary, I'm out of here. Okay, he said. I'll let them know. Oh, please, 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 corporation dudes, don't decide that you want to keep me, was my prayer during my shift that evening. And to my utter delight, my prayer was answered. I gave my 2 weeks' notice, and at the end of my last shift, I practically danced to my car in its usual spot beneath the street lamp in that lonely, isolated parking lot. No more tears and no more guilt over leaving my baby behind. Every night now, I would be at home together again with my little family, and that made my heart feel as if it were singing. Wanting to give myself a small vacation, I hadn't yet begun my search for a part-time radio job, but within a few days, I was approached by the program director of yet another FM station, WJIM. "Hi," he said over the phone after a brief introduction. "You sent us a tape some time ago, and I saved it because I like your voice. I'm sorry it's taken me so long to get back to you, but we only recently had a shift open up. You may not be interested, it's only part-time, but it never hurts to call. We need someone to fill our early morning weekend shift, Saturday and Sunday mornings, 6 until 10. Are you interested?" Whoa! Had the second part of my prayer already been answered? "Sure," I said. At this point, now that I've got a new baby at home, I'm only interested in part-time work. "Sounds good," he said. And he set up a time for us to meet. Though WJIM's format, easy listening, was boring as hell, the station, I was soon to discover, was a convenient 10-minute drive from our apartment. Even better was the sound of happy chatter and laughter that greeted my ears as soon as I walked through the station's front door. I smiled, knowing that I had found my new radio home. When the formal offer was made, I accepted, and before too long, my old program director, Jack, from WILS, joined me, becoming the new morning man for WJIM. "We're all following your lead," he joked. "You were right. Our salaries were too low over there, even before the pay cuts. It was time for a change." Paul must have decided he was ready for a change too. "I want a second baby," he announced out of the blue one day. "But I'm so happy with Abby," I said. "Do we really need another baby?" "If you have one child, you might as well have another," he said. "Abby would be lonely without a brother or a sister. Besides, I want another baby. I let you have the first one. Now it's your turn to let me have the second one." Damn, I thought. He had me. "Okay," I said. But deep down inside, I was hoping my body would not get pregnant, at least not any time soon. I wasn't ready for another round of non-stop pain and pushing a watermelon out my butt. God, larger mind, soul, energy friend, whoever has been guiding me, I prayed, my hand over my heart, utilizing yet again my old childhood prayer technique that had recently worked so well. I ask that we have a second baby only if it's for the highest good. I surrender this matter to you. Thank you. Amen. Surely, I thought, the world didn't need another baby. Surely, I thought, the guiding force in my life could see that we were perfectly happy as a family of 3. And surely, I thought, even if it were meant to be that our family expand, it would be a good long while before I'd ever have another baby growing inside me. Within a month, I was pregnant. By that time, I'd been working at WJIM for about half a year. My tears of separation, and also Abby's, never returned. It was as if both of us had decided that a small amount of separation was okay. The guys who worked for WJIM enjoyed any opportunity to joke and to laugh, and because of this, I began to write accounts of interesting happenings in the announcer's daily logbook, a small black notebook that was usually found in every radio station studio, but which most announcers, or so I had assumed, usually ignored. The pages of the logbook had seemed to be calling to me, so, thanks to my still ongoing practice of regular journal writing, for Abby's sake, in case anything ever happened to me, I opened the logbook and began to write one morning, and my fellow announcers, along with the station's sales personnel, began to read. They especially enjoyed my story about the black man who exposed himself outside one of our studio windows when I was by myself at the station one night, filling in for the early evening announcer. Unlike any of the other stations I had ever worked for, the announcing booth for WJIM was on public display. All that separated the announcers in the studio from the passers-by on the Frandor Shopping Center sidewalk were two gigantic plate glass windows. On the day that one of those passers-by on the sidewalk decided to expose his privates to me, I lifted the phone and dialed 911. But to my amazement, the line was busy. After a quick bit of thinking, I began to speak into the phone as the busy signal buzzed in my ear, pretending to describe to an imaginary dispatcher the guy outside the window fondling his naked penis. As I had hoped, Mr. Naked Penis quickly zipped up and ran away, but not my memory of him masturbating in front of me. The only way to cleanse my mind of such a memory was to write about him, I decided, and since my readers were a bunch of guys who loved to laugh, I knew that my angle for this story would be how this one fellow had single-handedly, actually double-handedly, destroyed the myth of the black man's large penis size. One of the salesmen, a guy who later caught the chicken pox from his children and served as the butt of many good-humored jokes for weeks afterwards, told me later, "I came in last week and all these guys are in the studio huddled around Jack. They were reading your story about that guy who exposed himself." He laughed. "We really enjoyed that one." I was relieved that no one at the station seemed to be repulsed or angered by my blossoming belly, which had grown more quickly during this pregnancy than it had during the first. Everyone at the station seemed to be happy for me. They even allowed me to bring Abby into work after I was asked to fill in occasionally for Phil, the station's one and only newsman. Phil got most of his stories off the wire, occasionally calling someone to confirm a fact or to record a quick interview over the phone. Since he was more of a newscaster than a reporter, I knew it would be no problem filling in for him during the week, as long as I could have Abby with me. That's how she ended up on the air one day. It was noon. I was delivering the news headlines, and Abby was outside the closed door of the news booth, which was separated from the main studio by a large, thick window. I had brought along some toys for her to play with, and Terry, the station's program director, had agreed to sit with her during the 15-minute newscast. In the background of the latter half of the newscast, there came the urgent call of a toddler. "Mama! Mama! Where are you?" I thought for sure the station manager would have a cow, but he thought it was funny. "I'm sure the listeners enjoyed it," he said. I think if Paul had not decided that it was time for an even greater change on top of a second baby, I would have enjoyed working for WJIM on a part-time basis until my children were in school. And then I probably would have moved back to full-time on-air work and, well, to be honest, I might have become a little bored by my job by then. I was beginning to feel the teeniest bit bored with my radio work even then, but I wasn't ready to admit that to anyone, including myself, because the folks at JIM had been so kind and supportive and so much fun to be around. I felt a great sense of loyalty to them, and that might have forced me to stay with them long after my heart was ready to move on. As it was, Paul forced me to move on far sooner than I would have chosen. "I feel like my soul is calling me back to Virginia," Paul announced one evening, and immediately I was suspicious. "Can't you get a tenure-track position at MSU?" I asked. "They only hire big-name researchers for tenure-track positions here." "But Dr. Sima said you were so talented." "Not as talented as the folks in this math department," he said. "Well, what about some other school in Michigan? I really like Michigan, and we've been so happy here." I loved Michigan's lakes and state parks, the snow in the wintertime, and the fact that I had given birth to a baby in Michigan and would soon be giving birth to another at the same hospital. I had roots in Michigan that felt more real to me than any roots I had ever had in North Carolina, in my parents' hometown, or in the Chapel Hill area, or in my birth state of Georgia, where all of my extended family still lived. Plus, Michigan was where Paul and I had finally learned how to become a true husband and wife. I didn't want to leave Michigan. It had been such a happy place for us. "I don't like living so far from our families," Paul said. "But we don't have to move to Virginia. We could move to North Carolina or Tennessee or Georgia. Why can't you apply to schools throughout the Southeast?" "I feel like my soul is asking me to return to Virginia," he said. I couldn't help but wonder if Paul might be attempting to manipulate me with spiritual-sounding language. But on the other hand, if he really had received an inner leading, I wanted to be supportive of this prompt from his soul. We had agreed at the beginning of our marriage that whoever made the most money would determine where we lived. But Paul had promised me, upon my insistence, that he would only apply for jobs in large university towns where there would be plenty of employment opportunities for me. That's why I assumed that even if we did move to Virginia, we would either end up in Williamsburg, where Paul had once been offered a job at the College of William and Mary, Charlottesville, where Paul could work for the University of Virginia, Harrisonburg, home to James Madison University, Blacksburg, the location of Virginia Tech, Richmond, or the D.C. areas, both of which were host to several universities, or, if Paul truly wanted to be close to his parents' home in Virginia Beach, Norfolk, the location of Old Dominion University. "Okay," I said. I told Paul that it would be fine with me if he applied for jobs in Virginia, and then I promptly forgot about the matter. I had by this time developed a new passion. As this second baby in my womb began to grow larger and larger, I found myself filled with an insatiable thirst for books about spiritual teachings, in particular the biographies of modern-day mystics, which to my mind meant any healer or spiritual teacher who had walked the earth since the invention of electricity. My favorite of the modern mystics quickly became Edgar Cayce. Known as the Sleeping Prophet, Cayce had spent a good deal of his adult life living beside the Atlantic Ocean in Paul's old hometown of Virginia Beach. Before his death in 1945, Cayce would several times a day enter into a deep, sleep-like, self-induced trance. From this trance, he would relay to his daily visitors any information that would help them to heal whatever ailment plagued them. Many holistically minded individuals, I discovered, considered Cayce to be a man ahead of his time. Back in the 30s and 40s, he advocated that a person's diet be composed mostly of fruits, vegetables, and whole grains. He admonished people for not drinking enough water, and over again, regular amounts of moderate exercise would be recommended. In his sleeping, trance-like state, he also talked a lot about the importance of a properly aligned body. Massage and chiropractic sessions were often prescribed, and when there was a part of the body in pain, Cayce's often repeated remedy was a hot castor oil pack. Although I agreed with Cayce's good old-fashioned common sense when it came to healthy practices of nutrition and exercise, I knew there was no way I would ever be able to prove that his trance-like sleeping state had been real. But I didn't care. To me, the most significant thing about Edgar Cayce was that he eventually came to embrace a belief in reincarnation. A serious and devout Christian who had always believed in the truth of biblical scripture, Cayce was initially upset after he learned that, while deep in his trance-like state, he would occasionally make references to an individual's past life experiences. Past life experiences, it seemed, most especially if they had been traumatic, could sometimes impact the health of an individual. Such a belief was not Christian, Casey believed. What was wrong with him, he wondered. Had the devil taken possession of him? That he was able to overcome such a fear in the midst of a strong southern tide of traditional Christian orthodoxy to embrace a belief in reincarnation impressed the hell out of me. But this was mainly because I didn't know of anyone else at that time who believed in reincarnation. None of the other mystics I had read about then had mentioned anything about reincarnation. Too bad he's dead, I remember thinking one day. I would have enjoyed meeting him. I balked at the idea that, from what I had read, many fans of Edgar Casey had placed him upon a pedestal, accepting everything he had said in his trance-like state as the gospel truth, including what, to me, sounded like silly New Age predictions about the future and fantastical stories about ancient Atlantis. But I liked the idea that because of Edgar Casey, I was no longer alone in my belief that I had lived before. Shortly after Abby was born, I remember gazing upon her late one night, and suddenly I knew that we had shared another lifetime from a long ago past. "You are back," I said aloud to the baby in my arms. "I can't remember what our relationship was in the past, but it sure is good to have you with me again. Thank you for returning, old friend." Would I feel the same way about our second baby? Whoever he or she was, the baby in my womb never seemed to move. Over and over again, outside of my regularly scheduled appointments at the OBGYN, I would make a frantic trip to the office and ask that one of the nurses please listen for the baby's heartbeat. Each week I would find myself worrying yet again, was my baby dead? Always I was reassured the baby was fine. "This is a child who just likes to sleep," I would be told. One nurse quipped, "Count your blessings, at least you're not being kept up at night." And it was true. There was no rolling, kicking baby to keep me awake at night, but I was not resting as soundly as I would have liked. Throughout the second half of my second pregnancy, I became haunted by a recurring dream that would leave me feeling racked with fear. Most of the dreams began in a mundane setting, in a grocery store, at a mall, or in the parking lot of a shopping center. Deep in my dream state, peacefully transferring cans of soup from a grocery store shelf into a shopping cart, standing beside my car pumping gas, or lazily flipping through a row of hanging shirts in a clothing store, some small movement in my peripheral vision would catch my attention, and there, off at a distance, on the other side of a mall, through the window of a store, or at the edge of a parking lot, would be the men in black robes. Each time I saw them, I was seized with the greatest fear I had ever known, far greater than anything I had felt when I had awakened to see or hear things in the dark that weren't supposed to be there when I was a little girl. Though I couldn't see the faces of these black-robed men, hidden as they were by the folds of large black cowls drooping low over their heads, I knew they were hunting me. I knew they wanted to kill me. In a sheer state of terror, I would drop whatever I was doing in the dream and run away from them as fast as I could, dashing into buildings, burrowing into the thick of a crowd, or racing towards a wood on the other side of a field. But no matter where I hid, the men in black robes always continued to advance, drawing closer and closer. In one dream, the last in a series of about 10 nightmares, I was in a car with my sister Whitney. I was driving. She was in the passenger seat beside me. It was dark except for the light of the car's headlights, which lit a narrow dirt road bordered by thick woods. Suddenly, the engine of the car died, and I couldn't get it to start again. The car rolled to a stop, wheels crunching upon the loose gravel in the road. Then came a fluttering movement from the trees on either side of me. The men in black robes. Frantically, I reached around the inside of the car, making sure all the doors were locked. Then I quickly shoved my sister to the floor of the car and bent over her protectively. "Don't let them take control of your mind. Sing with me," I screamed into her ear, and I began to sing as loud as I could the children's alphabet song, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P. To my horror, I saw that my sister wasn't singing. She had begun to whimper. "Sing with me," I yelled, my mouth touching her ear. A, B, C, D, E, F, G. It was too late. Her screams were that of a woman being physically tortured. I wanted to cry, but I couldn't. I had to keep singing. I couldn't let the men in black robes destroy me. I couldn't. I hadn't been able to save my sister, but I would save myself. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P. When I awoke, I was drenched in sweat. If I had been singing in my sleep, it must not have been too loud, because Paul was snoring lightly beside me. I felt one tiny kick from the baby in my womb that evening, and I wondered if he or she had been awakened by my terror. If so, the baby must not have been too traumatized, because that was the last bit of movement I felt from within that night. Later, when some time had passed, and I realized that it had been a long while since I had dreamt of the men in the black robes, I decided that I must have defeated them, or whoever or whatever they had represented to my dreaming mind. But I also wondered if these dreams had anything at all to do with the baby growing inside me. We had a number of neatly folded pink hand-me-down baby outfits that were stored in various boxes and drawers in our apartment. I think that's why we were, practically speaking, hoping for a second daughter. Over the months, our hopes evolved into expectations. The only problem was we hadn't been able to agree upon what this second daughter's name would be. By the time my water broke at 11 o'clock on a cold March night, we still had no name for the little baby girl we were now eagerly expecting. But we did have a boy's name, just in case we were wrong yet again about the predicted sex of our baby. This was a name Abby and I had come across while watching the PBS children's program Reading Rainbow one afternoon. We learned that day about 2 black lab puppies who were being trained to be leader dogs for the blind. The brother and sister pups were named Abby and Austin. How cute, I thought. How well the 2 names went together. I was relieved when, later that evening, Paul said he liked the name Austin. "Hey, if the baby is a boy, we could name him Austin Paul," I said. Paul had smiled. "That would be nice." Austin Paul Bourdon, weighing in at 9 pounds 3 ounces, made his entrance into the world at Lansing's Sparrow Hospital, March 9th, 1988, at 1 o'clock in the morning. My labor the second time around had lasted exactly 2 hours, and, just as before, my body had taken complete charge of my breathing. This time around, however, though my breathing had remained as slow and as deep as it had during my first labor, instead of a doggy-style perch on my hands and knees, my body had demanded that I remain seated atop the hospital bed, legs crossed beneath me, back perfectly straight, as if I were participating in a deep breathing yoga class. "Look at that," I remember one of the nurses saying. "She's 8 centimeters dilated, and she's still doing her deep breathing. What she didn't know is that although I had given birth once before, I still had that familiar loop of non-stop panic running through my head. This time my mind's fearfully repeated mantra was, "This is awful. It's never going to end. This is awful. It's never going to end." That's why I think I tipped so easily towards temptation a short while later. No one had bothered to tell me ahead of time that the hospital drug policy for laboring women had changed since I had last given birth. About 20 minutes after I had settled into my deep-breathing yogic position upon my tall hospital bed in the birthing suite, a nurse had stopped by holding a small metal tray topped by miniature paper cups filled with pills. "Would you like something to take the edge off your pain?" she asked. "I thought you guys were anti-drug," I quickly interjected in between one of my long, slow breaths. She chuckled. "The hospital changed its policy." "Then I want an epidural," I proclaimed. 2 years before, I had read about the miraculous pain-removing effects of epidurals. I didn't want my pain to be softened. I wanted it to be knocked clean out of the ballpark. "But you're doing so well," she said. "You don't need an epidural." "I need the pain to be over now," I quickly blurted out. And then at the end of another breath, I added, "Otherwise, I might start screaming." Within a few minutes, an anesthesiologist hustled into the room to administer the epidural. But as soon as he saw me, he huffed with irritation. "You don't need this," he said, glaring at my cross-legged, deep-breathing form. "I'm maintaining this calm because of the promise of relief," I lied. And then after another long breath, "Give me my epidural." I knew even then that it was my body, not my mind, maintaining the appearance of deep-breathing calm. "Your baby will be out of you before this even takes effect," he said. "I don't care. Give it to me now." I got my epidural, and everything the anesthesiologist had predicted came to pass. Not until after I had pushed baby Austin into the world did I begin to feel the first tingling sensations of the lower half of my body going numb. When Paul held Austin for the first time, he became very emotional and began to cry. I was a little surprised. Never could I have imagined that this seasoned father of one would be so touched by the presence of a second baby. But this was a baby he had requested. Did he have perhaps a past life connection to the soul of this child? Or was it simply some kind of a mystical male-to-male bond I had just witnessed? Later that night, after I was finally able to be completely on my own with baby Austin, by this time Sparrow Hospital was also allowing mothers to keep their babies in the room with them, I couldn't stop staring at his peaceful, sleeping face. Yes, even outside of the womb, he was still sleeping. I wondered, while I stared at his face that reminded me so much of my mother's recently deceased father, if Austin had even bothered to wake up as he was being pushed out of my body. But even in his sleeping state, he knew exactly what to do. He would tell me when he was hungry by drawing his lightly colored eyebrows together and becoming slightly fidgety, as if there were some small bit of unpleasantness in his body that was disturbing his sleep. As soon as I put him to my breast, he would begin to suckle, eyes always closed, milking each breast for exactly 10 minutes. Then he would become completely still again and remain so for another 4 to 5 hours. Not even diaper changes caused him to wake up. Either he was a sleeping Buddha, or his soul was too cool to be bothered with the mundane existence of a newborn. "Who are you?" I kept asking him that first night in the hospital. Where did you come from?" 2 years earlier, while gazing upon baby Abby's newborn face, I had concluded that we'd already been together in another lifetime. But with baby Austin, there was no feeling of having known him before. He was, I decided, someone who was completely new to me in every sense of the word. Years later, as I was relaying this story to a man from Kenya, he broke into peals of merry laughter. "A mother looks at her baby and says, 'Where did you come from?' That is crazy." And yes, I am well aware of the fact that I don't know how to do a Kenyan accent. The attending doctor for my second round of labor, a female whose name I have forgotten, gave me a warning after Austin's birth. "If you decide ever to get pregnant again, know this: your labor is going to be far shorter the third time. Your baby might even be born on your way to the hospital." Thank goodness neither Paul nor I were ever inwardly led or inspired to have another baby. I was lucky that Austin remained such an easy-to-care-for baby. He continued to sleep for a good 4 to 5 hours between feedings, which meant that even though I checked on him often to make sure he was still breathing, I did not feel as sleep-deprived as I had with Abby, who as a young baby had wanted to feed 20 minutes per breast every 2 hours. Even as he got to be older and wasn't sleeping so much during the day, Austin hardly ever cried. Maybe this is because he became so completely enamored by his older sister, who enjoyed entertaining her little brother in his baby carrier whenever I was doing laundry or fixing dinner. She also began to speak for him. "Mama," she would say, "Austin wants us to go for a walk." Or, "Mama, Austin wants you to read us a book." After Austin was old enough to point toward objects, all he needed to do was raise a finger, and Abby would run to get whatever it was she was sure he wanted. Like his sister before him, Austin's teeth began to come in at quite an early age, so that by the time he was 5 months old and had all of his baby teeth, he was eating a variety of solid foods that most babies could only dream of eating. By the time he was 7 months old, he had mastered the art of chewing every bit of solid food he had ever seen us eat. One day, at a hamburger joint, while Austin was in a high chair eating small bits of cut-up cheeseburger, an old man walked up to him, beaming from ear to ear. "Look at that," he said. "A baby eating a cheeseburger. I can't wait to tell my daughter about this. She still feeds my grandson baby food out of a jar." It was probably because her son didn't have all of his teeth, as Austin did, but I didn't say anything. The old man looked so overjoyed. By this time, Austin had grown into a roly-poly baby who was always smiling, especially when he was eating, and most especially when he was watching the antics of his older sister. Abby loved to sing and to dance for Austin, and at a very young age, after she had memorized all the words to her favorite books, she would read to him every day. Once he was crawling, he began to follow her everywhere, and soon I discovered that I could trust Abby to be my second pair of mother eyes. "No, no, Austin," I would hear her say. "That's a no-no." I would turn and see that she had just prevented Austin from eating a dead bug or a leaf from a potted houseplant. Always, he did as his sister told him, but never once did she abuse her power over her little brother. She was, I decided, turning into a much better big sister than I had ever been to my younger siblings. I didn't think I had ever known such joy. Everything about our lives was perfect, absolutely perfect, until the day Paul announced that he had accepted a tenure-track position at his old alma mater, Washington and Lee University in Lexington, Virginia. When he was first invited to interview for the position by an old math professor friend of his, I had assumed he wasn't serious about the job. After all, Paul was a researcher, and Washington and Lee was known at that time to be a teaching rather than a research institute. But in addition to that, the town of Lexington was far too small, and Paul had promised me years before that he would only apply for jobs in large university towns. When he had agreed to interview for the job, it was, I had assumed, simply a courtesy to his old professor friend. Earlier in our marriage, Paul had taken me to Lexington so he could introduce me to this friend of his, the math professor who had encouraged him to go to graduate school. Although I had enjoyed meeting this professor, I had been unimpressed by the little town of Lexington. Not only was the town too small for my taste, a dark overhanging cloud cover had remained in the sky for the duration of our first visit and during our entire subsequent visit 2 years later. "Does the sun never shine upon this place?" I had asked. Although the beautiful Blue Ridge Mountains bordered the area to the east, and the Allegheny Mountains bordered the area to the west, the area between the two mountain ranges that surrounded Lexington felt as if it were covered by a heavy, invisible blanket of sad and depressing energy. "I sure would hate to live here," I remember telling Paul during our first visit. And I had meant it. How could Paul possibly expect me to live in the one place I had openly declared I would hate to ever call home? "I can't live in Lexington," I declared in response to his announcement. "The town's too small and the land there feels too damn depressing." "Don't curse in front of the children," Paul said. I gave him the finger. "You once told me you wanted to be a writer," he said. "Lexington would be a perfect location for a writer." "For God's sake, you knew I wasn't serious when I said that." "Well, we could buy a farm," he said. "While I was a student at W&L, I used to notice how inexpensive the advertised farms were. Maybe we could buy a small farm and you could raise chickens and keep a garden." "Now you want me to be a farmer?" I squeaked. "That was always your dream, not mine. You're the one who used to talk about following in the footsteps of your grandfather and uncles, growing fields of you-pick-em strawberries. I don't give a fuck about farming." "Stop cursing," Paul admonished. "Well, there won't be anything for me to do in a place like Lexington. I won't be able to find a job." "They have a radio station," he said. "You could work there." "Oh, yeah? What's its format?" Paul hesitated. He knew that although there were some music formats I preferred over others, there was one music format that I detested. For some reason, it made my skin crawl. To hear the music of this format was, to my ears, pure torture, and I had sworn to myself that I would never, ever work at a radio station that played this particular format. Paul glanced at me sheepishly. "The station's format is country," he finally murmured. "Paul," I said, "you know how much I hate country music. Like I said, there won't be anything for me to do in that horrible little town." "Shelley," he said, "how can you say you won't have anything to do? You'll be raising our children. Look at how much you enjoy staying at home with the kids." Yes, it was true. I loved staying at home with my children, but I also knew that it would be wrong for me to become completely dependent on my husband's paycheck. "I will need a paid job," I spat. "Marriages don't necessarily last forever, you know. For my own self-protection, I have to keep earning some kind of a paycheck." Abby and Austin's eyes were as big as golf balls. This was the first time they had heard their parents arguing, and it was the first time they had witnessed one of their mother's volcanic eruptions. I knew they were frightened by my outburst, but I couldn't control myself. I was so exceedingly angry at the idea of moving to this dinky, depressing little town. "I'm sure there will be plenty of employment opportunities for you at W&L," Paul said. taking on an assuring tone. "Maybe you could get a job working in their library." "In case you forgot," I said, "I don't have a library degree. They wouldn't be interested in me." "But this is a small liberal arts college we're talking about," he said. "Their policy may be different than UNC's." I doubted that would be the case. I also now doubted that I would ever be happy if I remained married to Paul. In one brief instant, my husband had quickly transformed into my enemy once again. How could he treat me this way? Didn't he realize how unstable marriages were? Didn't he realize that married women could no longer remain financially dependent upon their husbands? How could he not see how important it was for a woman to keep at least one foot in the world of career, even if she were raising children at home? Quickly, I began to scheme. I could move back to North Carolina and live near my parents. I'd find a full-time radio position, and with child support checks coming in from Paul each month, I could make it work, most especially if my mother stayed with Abby and Austin during the day while I was at work. And if my salary wasn't large enough working on air as a DJ, I could start selling ads for a station. Everyone knew it was the salespeople in radio who made the highest salaries. The kids would grow up knowing their grandparents and also their aunt, my sister, who lived within an hour of my parents. And they could see Paul during holidays and the summertime. In fact, they could spend the entire summer with him. He would be able to take them fishing in the Chesapeake Bay on his father's boat, and they would be able to go to the beach every day, just as he had when he was growing up. I turned to look at Paul, who was on the floor now. Austin was in his lap. Abby, before him on the living room floor, was demonstrating one of her happy little dances. It was obvious to me that Paul loved his children, and it was obvious they loved him. I sighed. Divorce wasn't such a simple affair once there were children in the picture. And what guarantee did I have that I would be able to maintain full custody of the children? Paul might decide to put up a fight. And if so, what would happen if a judge ruled in his favor? Too attached to my children now, I knew I wouldn't be able to live without them. I could never, ever be without them. Not now. It was like they were permanently attached to my heart. To be without my children would kill me. As if reading my mind, Paul said, "Lexington would be a great place to raise children. It would be safer, less crime, less drugs, and the pace of life would be slower there than it is here." Abby was singing now, reaching over to tickle Austin on the belly in order to make him laugh. God, they were such happy little children. Would they remain this happy if I broke up the family? "Shelley," Paul said, "no other schools were interested in me. I had to accept this job." "Well, you would have had other job offers if you had applied to schools outside of Virginia," I countered. "I already told you. I felt like my soul was calling me back to Virginia." Crap. I was so totally screwed. After the children were grown, I would probably become one of those alcoholics who spent the day in her bathrobe watching soaps on television. In my mind's eye, I could already see myself on the sofa in front of the TV, a glass of amber-colored spirits on the coffee table in front of me, a cigarette dangling from my mouth. No, not a cigarette. The image of myself back in college, cigarette positioned between my lips when I had stood in front of the bathroom mirror, suddenly flashed through my mind. I certainly didn't want to look like that. So I changed my imagined scene. Now it was the glass of intoxicating yellow liquid that touched my lips, sad, pouty lips in the middle of a pasty face framed by dirty, matted hair. "Woe is me," are the words that came to my mind. These words of the old Hebrew prophet Isaiah now fit me to a T. Gone was my old desire to learn the lessons of my soul. Gone was my old sense of purpose, learning how to love others. Gone was my old belief that I had been led by a higher power to a place of benefit. Woe is me. My life is screwed. Though I tried each day to act as normal as possible around the children, on the inside I continued to angrily fume, surrounded by a dark cloud of negative thoughts, until the day of our move in early August 1988. When moving day arrived, I wasn't the only one fuming. Shortly before we said our final goodbyes to our spacious apartment beneath the shade of the overhanging oak tree, 2.5-year-old Abby obstinately plopped her fanny down on the top step of the stairwell outside our apartment door. "I don't want to leave," she wailed, tears streaming down her cheeks. "This is my home." Paul and Austin were already outside by then, on their way to the parking lot. Not a stick of furniture remained in what had been our happy, happy home. I had minutes before been forced to give away 2 of my beloved potted plants to a total stranger, some new guy who had just moved in next door. At the very last minute, we had discovered there was no room for my plants in either of our cars. These plants had been with me since my sophomore year of college. I too now wanted to sit at the top of the stairs and wail, but instead I settled beside Abby and gently rocked her in my arms. "I wish we didn't have to move, but Daddy has a new job and my old job wouldn't make enough money for us to live on. I'm so sorry, but we have to leave." Abby's sobs only strengthened, and I couldn't help myself. Now I too was weeping. Wiping my eyes, a line from one of the Psalms came to mind. "By the waters of Babylon we sat down and wept." How aptly it spoke to our condition. Paul was uprooting us from our home, forcing us to live in a land that felt foreign to me, dismal and gray. But as unhappy as I was, I couldn't bear to see my normally joyful daughter suffering so. "Abby," I said, lifting her onto my lap, "in our new home, you'll have your very own room, and you and Austin will have a backyard to play in, and maybe we can finally buy you one of those plastic kiddie pools you've always wanted." Her sobs did not lessen. So I tried a new approach. Was there, I asked myself, anything at all about Lexington that I had liked? An image of the Blue Ridge Mountains came to mind. And I remembered that Abby, too, loved the Blue Ridge, that portion of the mountain chain she had come to know in western North Carolina during our visits to my parents' home. "Guess what, Miss Abby?" I said as I rubbed her back. "After we get settled into our new home, I'll be able to drive you up to the Blue Ridge Parkway whenever you like. Lexington is only 6 miles away from the Blue Ridge. We'll be able to stand up on a mountain and be higher than the birds fly, so high that we'll be able to see for miles and miles, just like an eagle into the valley below. Won't that be fun?" Her sobs stilled to a soft whimper. Slowly, she shook her head yes. Lifting her up, I carried my damp-faced daughter down the stairs, out the front door of our apartment building, and across the asphalt lot to where both our cars were parked. The Allied moving van, having been loaded with all our belongings an hour or so before, was gone. Paul had already gotten Austin buckled into his baby seat inside my car. Now it was my turn to get Abby buckled into her big girl car seat in Paul's car. After I shut the door, she looked at me through Paul's car window with her sad, sad eyes that still seemed to be asking, "Why, Mama? Why do we have to leave?" By the time I cranked my own car, I was crying again.